President Trump, in the last few moments, has slammed Ukraine's President Zelensky as a dictator without elections. In the past few minutes, he has posted this on his Truth Social platform. Let me just take you through some of the detail. Quite a lengthy post, as you can see there. He says that President Zelensky refuses to have elections, is very low in Ukrainian polls. He's claiming that President Zelensky has about a 4% rating. Polls suggest it's 57%. He goes on, the only thing he was good at was playing Biden like a fiddle. He then calls President Zelensky a dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he is not going to have a country left. He goes on, in the meantime, we're successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia, something all admit only Trump and the Trump administration can do. Biden never tried, he claims. Europe has failed to bring peace, and Zelensky probably wants to keep the gravy train going. President Trump goes on, I love Ukraine, but Zelensky has done a terrible job. His country is shattered and millions have unnecessarily died. And so it continues. He also calls Volodymyr Zelensky a moderately successful comedian, talking America into spending billions of dollars to go into a war that couldn't be won. He says the US has spent $200 billion more than Europe, and Europe's money is guaranteed, while the US will get nothing back. Well, all of this happening now as a number of discussions continue about the future of Ukraine, some of them without Ukraine involved. In Russia, President Vladimir Putin has delivered a pretty positive verdict on Tuesday's talks between the US and Russia. Those are the talks that took place in Saudi Arabia, saying he rates them highly. Speaking to reporters earlier, Mr. Putin said the purpose of that meeting was to increase trust. He said he is happy to meet President Trump, and there has been some indication in Moscow today it could even be as early as this month. He says he expects Ukraine will take part in talks at some point.
Yes, I have been informed. I rate them highly. There are results. The first thing I would like to say is that we have agreed to resume the normal work of diplomatic agencies. The constant expulsion of diplomats from Washington and Moscow does not lead to anything good. If this goes on, only cleaners will work in these buildings, whose work should be also appreciated. But this is not what diplomatic missions are created for.
Well, Ukraine's leader, President Volodymyr Zelensky, had earlier said President Trump was living in a bubble of Russian disinformation. Ukraine was excluded from those talks in Saudi Arabia between America and Russian officials. And here is President Zelensky speaking earlier.
Since we are talking about 4%, we have seen this disinformation. We understand that it is coming from Russia. We understand and we have evidence that these numbers are being discussed between America and Russia. It is unfortunate that President Trump, and with great respect for him as the leader of the American people who constantly support us, unfortunately lives in this disinformation space.
Joining me now, our correspondent Nomia Iqbal, who's in Washington, and also to Vitaly Shevchenko from BBC Monitoring, who's been following Putin's remarks. But first to Nomia. Nomia, one of my guests earlier was saying that we have to pay attention to what President Trump does rather than what he says. But there does seem to be a war of words at the moment, and certainly looking at those latest comments on his Truth Social platform. What's your analysis of what he said?
Well, yeah, I think that that's not, entirely incorrect. It's what he does, not what he says. But what he says is hugely significant. Do remember he's in his last term in office. But look, I don't think anyone was under the illusion that things were going to be under President Trump as they were under President Biden when it comes to Ukraine. His comments are still pretty extraordinary. They're very long, but the fact that it's important to sort of first of all stress that Kyiv last held an election in 2019, has been unable to stage another one since Russia's invasion in early 2022. But saying he's a dictator without elections is quite extraordinary, because I don't think that those are words he'd necessarily use about the Russian President Vladimir Putin. In fact, I think that's something that has stood out with Donald Trump again. It was similar to his first term. He seems to criticize everyone but Putin. I mean, last week, Mr. Trump had accused President Joe Biden of starting the war in Ukraine. He wants to have this closer alignment to Russia. I think there was always an expectation that he was going to say something. He's in Miami at the moment on a business meeting, but it's not particularly helpful considering he's got his special envoy to Ukraine, Mr. Kellogg, in the country right now, holding talks with Mr. Zelensky.
Yes, Keith Kellogg, who says his mission there is to listen to Ukraine's concerns. So a bit of a mismatch between that and what President Trump is saying. What sort of reaction are you getting there in the US? Probably not to these latest comments, they've only just happened. But what kind of reaction are you seeing there in the US, especially among Republican politicians, to the way President Trump is handling this?
Well, the aid that has been sent to Ukraine so far was passed by Congress, so there is bipartisan support for helping Ukraine. There will certainly be Republicans who are uneasy with what Donald Trump is saying, but in terms of them actually saying anything publicly, is probably going to be a bit of a stretch. The party is incredibly loyal to Donald Trump, even more so now. Democrats, on the other hand, of course, they very different. They have been alarmed by what Mr. Trump said in regards to blaming Mr. Zelensky for the war. Senator Chris Murphy for Connecticut, he serves on the Foreign Relations Committee. He said, I'm going to quote what he said, he accused the president of lying to the American people, of essentially rewriting history. As I mentioned, Mr. Trump last week even accused President Biden of starting the war. But I think something that is probably important to add here is that, foreign policy aside, and if you add the domestic angle in, Donald Trump campaigned on the promise to end the war in Ukraine. Just recently, I spent a bit of time in Pennsylvania. It's a swing state that Donald Trump won last year. And, for a lot of the voters that I spoke to, those who were for Trump, those who were against, there was some overlap in terms of Ukraine, most of them saying that they didn't think that the US should continue being involved in Ukraine. So Donald Trump, as far as he's concerned, he's delivering on a campaign promise. But of course, this reset of relations with Moscow, the concern for Ukraine and Europe is that it might come at a huge cost for Ukraine.
OK, Nomia, thank you very much. Let's bring in Vitaly Shevchenko from BBC Monitoring. Vitaly, looking at what President Trump has just said, what he's been saying in recent days and what President Putin has been saying, are you seeing any kind of mirroring in the language of the two men?
Well, Anita, it's so tempting to speak about what's going on, what they're saying in superlatives and epithets. It's truly extraordinary. The Russian and American positions on Ukraine specifically, they're almost perfectly aligned. First, we heard from Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary, say that NATO membership for Ukraine ruled out, getting territories back ruled out, and now Donald Trump is saying that Volodymyr Zelensky is a dictator, he lost his mandate, and Ukraine started the war. Well, my job is to monitor the Russian media, and that's what they've been saying for years. And it's truly extraordinary to hear that come from Donald Trump. Now, there are opinions and there are also facts. Of course, we can argue about how successful or otherwise Volodymyr Zelensky was as a comedian. But in terms of his popularity, the opinion polls that I've seen, credible opinion polls from Ukraine, they suggest that his approval ratings, Volodymyr Zelensky, he enjoys a slightly bigger approval rating than Donald Trump in America. And in terms of elections, Ukrainian law specifically forbids holding presidential, parliamentary, local elections at a time of war. So these remarks, they will come as a shock to many Ukrainians who also, well, they'll have a huge issue with Donald Trump saying, well, it's Ukraine that started the war. In terms of how you row back from these remarks, it's really difficult to imagine an easy way of doing that. And it's beginning to look like Ukraine is losing or has lost America as an ally. And what Donald Trump has been saying for days suggests that Well, he's much friendlier towards Vladimir Putin than he is towards Volodymyr Zelensky.
Briefly, Vitaly, what is the Russian media saying in response to all of this? Give us a sense of that.
Oh, they are overjoyed. They are saying that this is very good news for us. They haven't really embraced Donald Trump as a friend. They're saying that he still has America's interest at his heart, but he's clearly driving a wedge right into the heart of the Western alliance. And one commentator on Russia's Channel 1 says, it works for us.
Vitaly, thank you very much. Vitaly Shevchenko and Nomia Iqbal there in Washington. Thank you both very much.